Well, good morning and welcome to Elevenses. I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training. This is show 378. It's Wednesday, the 25th of October, and it is a bit of a grey day here in London. Some brightness around, not particularly warm, about 11 or 12 degrees at the moment. So autumn really is with us at last. But anyway, good to see you all. What have I got in the show for you today? Well, unfortunately, £120,000 worth of motorcycles were lifted from a motorcycle showroom in Wigan. I've got a video which shows you how to steal a Yamaha in just 20 seconds. France is finally introducing their control technique, the MOT equivalent for motorcycles, that will come in next spring. A lithium deposit in Nevada could be huge. A Moto 3 rider started a race despite being knocked out in a warm-up crash, which is against all the safety protocols. Of course, we'll have a quick look at that, and also have a look at the implications of head injuries actually for motorcycle riders generally. Yamaha and CFMoto have announced a link, which is interesting. We'll have a quick look at an airbag shirt, which comes without a functioning airbag. And we'll also ask if motorcycles really need a lean assist technology, which is something that Honda seem to have been working on. Only one bike today, and that's a mini bike. It's an electric mini race bike from Yamaha. And science of staying warm is today's in-depth feature. I was going to run something group riding, but I've pushed that back a couple of weeks actually, because it is that time of year when everybody starts to get cold, and all the adverts and all the blog articles and things start coming out advising you to buy heated grips and thermal vests, and I'll tell you why that's not such a great idea over the next 2 weeks. So stay with me as we carry on and introduce all those topics. If you have got a comment, if you have got a question, do drop me a line. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll answer live if I possibly can, and if I can't, I'll get back to you at the end of the show. Oh, and finally, I've got an apology for anybody who wanted to watch this on Facebook and is now over on YouTube. I'm afraid for some reason the system has had scheduling problems this morning. I don't know why. All I got is an alert via my server software which told me that streams aren't going out as originally planned on Facebook. So I don't know what's gone wrong there, but hopefully you have found me here on YouTube. Right, okay, so on with the first item in the show. I just want to very quickly remind you that I am on Blue Sky now. If you do have an account over there, you will be one of the few, because it is invite only for the moment, but I am over there, and I have started dual posting. Everything that goes on Twitter now goes on Blue Sky as well, and I dare say that at some point in the not too distant future I will actually move the account over there altogether. So if you have managed to set up an account, come and look me up. Hopefully when I get some invites of my own to hand out, I will be able to invite a few people over. Okay, now what else have we got to talk about? Well, weather forecast. Just keep an eye on the forecast. There are weather warnings around again for rain through the Midlands, and certainly up into the north of England, I think. The ground is pretty wet after the heavy rain from Babette. Still fairly dry actually here in London. The garden's not a bog yet, but certainly in a lot of areas there is still a lot of water around, so any rain that falls will be falling onto pretty wet ground, so it could flood in certain places pretty quickly, so do watch out for that. Right, okay, so on with the news then. What have I got for you today? What's our first story? Well, police in Wigan are appealing for witnesses to a break-in, not just one break-in, a multiple break-in in a way, at the motorcycle dealers, which apparently removed £120,000 worth of KTM motorcycles. Now, the incident happened between 9 p.m. and midnight on Friday the 13th into Saturday 14th of October, when a white transit van and a white VW Golf excuse me, appeared at a showroom on Pennyhurst Street. Now, apparently what happened was that around about 9 p.m. The thieves, who were all wearing dark clothing and face coverings, of course, broke the lock on the access gate. They then reversed the van up to the building. Now, having climbed onto the van roof, they were able to smash a first floor window, which gained them access to the showroom. This is the fairly amazing bit. They then wheeled the bikes out of the window onto the van roof, and then they dropped the bikes off the van onto some bags below, presumably caught them before they fell over. Now, astonishingly, even more astonishingly in some ways, they came back twice more that night, each time loading the van up with more bikes. So fairly audacious theft there, which appears that nobody actually noticed. Now, in a way, this particular video is even more alarming. It's actually an MT-15, by the way, and it's being stolen in Malaysia. But just watch how easily the thieves get away with this particular bike. The entire clip is just 24 seconds long. Apologies for the volume level there. That really is very scary indeed. Now, obviously, the motorcycle doesn't have any additional security on it. There was no disc lock or anything to break. But the rider doesn't just force the steering lock, having presumably wedged some kind of screwdriver or something into the steering, the actual ignition comes on. Now, I thought these things were supposed to have immobilizers that were keyed to the ignition key, but clearly that's not the case with this particular machine. Whack the screwdriver in, turn the ignition, and the bike just is ridden away. I mean, this is no better security, frankly, than was available on my 1975 125, which is absolutely appalling. 50 years on, and bikes are still being stolen in exactly the same way. It really is time manufacturers were made responsible for this kind of theft. Right, okay, over in France, the start date for the forthcoming obligatory control technique, CT, tests for motorcycles, scooters, trikes and road-going quads over 50cc has been set. The on, off and now on again equivalent of the British MOT will be phased in from April 2024. Now, around 4 million motorcycles are going to be affected by the CT test, which covers the usual stuff, safety checks, emission levels and noise. But to avoid overwhelming the testing stations, the rollout will be phased in. So vehicles dating from before January the 1st, 2017 must undergo their first CT test before mid-August 2024, so it gives you a few months to sort that out. As vehicles reach 5 years old, they will have to undergo their first CT test, and then for vehicles dating from 2022, the first CT test has to happen 6 months before they are 5 years old, which will be in 2027 if you've done the maths there. So obviously the prices are of concern to riders, but apparently have still not been announced. Back in June, the Transport Minister, who was Clement Beaune, said that they should be as low as possible, and €50 has been bandied about, but there's still no confirmation on that. Around 4 million motorcycles will be affected. Oh, I've just said that, haven't I? The French government has had to introduce these because they're of a 2014 ruling by the European Commission, which said that these tests should actually have been implemented before 2022. But it was delayed because of protests by motorcyclists themselves. Then there was personal intervention by President Macron. But after a legal challenge, the government announced that the CT test would in fact go ahead and it would be introduced next year. But one garage owner from Nice was quoted in the press as saying, "We don't know what's happening, there is no training or equipment in place." So it seems that the French are in a bit of a muddle over their control tests. Right, okay. Over in the USA, it appears a new study that's just been published by scientists in the journal Science Advances suggests that a new lithium deposit which has been discovered in Nevada could be one of the largest in the world, but moreover it could be one of the very easiest to mine. Now, lithium deposits are currently found in Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, China and Australia. That's where nearly all the lithium that goes into electric batteries comes from. But the find in the USA could be 20 to 40 million tons of the metal. There's just one hitch here. The deposit is located in a very sparsely populated area of the state. Well, that's most of Nevada, frankly, having ridden through it. Most of it is deserted, but it's on the land which is ancestral territory of the Paiute and the Shoshone tribes. Now, both of these tribes have tried to prevent open-air lithium mines from being constructed on other land which is associated with the tribes nearby in the past, but both of those efforts failed. So I'd foresee that there will be quite a lot of arguments in the courts before this mine may or may not get the go-ahead. Right, a couple of comments here. Kevin says hello. Christine says hello. Yeah, sorry about dragging everybody over to YouTube this morning. The problem is that the server software which I use has had problems hitching up with Facebook this morning. The server company that I use, they are investigating and they say that the problem is at Facebook's end, which doesn't surprise me in the least, quite frankly. Right, okay, so what else have we got to talk about today? Well, the lines between the old guard of motorcycle companies and the burgeoning Chinese manufacturers has just blurred a step further, because CFMoto and Yamaha have just announced a joint venture to manufacture bikes in China. The collaboration is through a new company, which is Zusu CF Yamaha Motor Company. Zusu just happens to be the name of a Chinese international race circuit, incidentally. Now, as you likely know, if you follow Elevenses, CFMoto is always already in partnership with the Pira Mobility Group. They are the company who own the brands KTM, Husqvarna, GasGas, and a couple of others, I think, as well. Now, CFMoto currently build the 790cc engined range of machines for KTM, and they themselves use KTM's engine technology to create their own bikes, like the 800 MT. Now, little is known about how this joint CFMoto Yamaha venture is going to operate, what motorcycles will be produced. That's all to discover. But what's known is that CFMoto will be the majority shareholder. They will hold 50% of the stake in their new company, and Yamaha will own most of the rest, just over 44%. So quite how Pira will take the news that CFMoto are now also allied with Yamaha, I don't know. That'll be an interesting one indeed. Now, over in the Moto GP world, an investigation is currently underway to discover how the Brazilian Moto 3 rider Diogo Moreira was able to start the Australian Moto 3 race at Phillip Island, because he was actually knocked out by a crash on the sighting lap. Now, Moreira apparently managed to get his KTM back on two wheels. He then rode it back to the pit. Emergency repairs were undertaken in the pit lane, and he was able to start the race behind the pack from the pit lane exit. But he pulled in after 4 laps, complaining of feeling dizzy. Now, it was later determined that Moreira had actually lost consciousness after the crash. Now, FIM regulations seek to prevent any rider who loses consciousness after a fall from competing until they are cleared to do so. Now, his team, MT Helmets MSI, they published a statement saying that they were not aware that he had been unconscious. But this is a particularly important lapse in protocol, since a study of crash types and injury patterns in Moto GP actually suggests that around 20% of falls resulted in concussion injuries. Now, but the problem here extends far beyond Moto GP, of course, as I'm sure you're aware. A recent Australian study, for example, of crashes and injuries suggested that 19% of youth motocross riders involved in crashes had exhibited concussion symptoms, and they calculated from this that the average youth rider therefore had a chance of almost 3% of experiencing a concussion in a single season. Now, I'm sure you also know that head injuries are linked to the development of degenerative brain diseases. Now, a recent study of former rugby union players' brains has found that those that played for longer were more likely to have developed the condition linked to repeated head injuries and concussions. And the researchers are saying that their findings back up calls to reduce head impacts in all sports. And as the data shows, of course, it's not just the people who play contact sports such as football, boxing, rugby and American football that need to be looked at. It's motorcycle racers too. So what do you do if you have had a concussion? Well, the UK Motorsports Association, the MSA, they introduced concussion guidelines as early as 2016. What they advised was removal from competition for 14 to 21 days after a diagnosis. Now, similarly, Speedway New Zealand, they mandate a 22 stand down period for any rider who is diagnosed with a concussion, and that can be reduced to an absolute minimum of 15 days if you go for a formal medical assessment and then get board approval. But what about road riders? Well, after a severe concussion, it's been shown that both task and driving performance are reduced after injury, and studies have shown that traffic hazard perception is also impaired in the short term. But at the moment, there's nothing to say that you have to submit yourself to a hospital inspection if you've had a concussion. I remember many years ago, actually, I fell off the bike and I almost certainly knocked myself out for a second or two. I certainly remember coming to in the middle of the road. But the ambulance service obviously wanted to take me off to hospital, but I kind of did the sums and realised that abandoning my motorcycle in the middle of a dual carriageway would actually cost me quite a lot of money, as the police recovered it and then charged me for storage and that kind of stuff. So I actually got back on the bike and rode home again, which probably wasn't the most sensible thing to do. So what do we do? Well, I honestly think that there ought to be some guidance to motorcyclists about this, because there isn't any at the moment, and it would seem advisable that we go to the casualty or something, get checked over, and that we do follow a similar don't ride protocol voluntarily. But longer term, there seems to have been next to no work done on following up the effects of these impacts on ordinary motorcyclists. So, okay, that's probably quite an interesting point there. I'd be certainly interested to hear from anyone who has themselves suffered a concussion on a motorcycle, even if it is just out on the road, and what they did about it, and what symptoms, if they did experience any, they did note whilst they were out on the bike. Right, now, okay, moving on to the next item on the show. Whilst it's a legal requirement to wear a helmet on the road, other protective clothing is, of course, optional. But more and more riders are looking at airbag protectors of the sort that are now commonly worn by Moto GP riders. Now, the first of these airbags were actually built into jackets, so you had to buy the jacket and the airbag, or they were built into leathers, so again you had to buy the leathers with the airbag. But more and more frequently, what we're seeing are undershirts which have an airbag built into them, which means, of course, if you've got a reasonably roomy jacket over the top, you can pop one of these under your outer clothing which you already own, and Bob's your uncle, now you have an airbag. The trouble is they aren't coming cheap. This one here is the airbag armor shirt from RST, and despite the name and the £389.99 price tag, it doesn't actually come with an airbag in this lightweight vest, at least not one that works anyway, because what it is fitted with is a level 1 back protector. It's got level 2 armor in the shoulder and elbow areas, and you get the astonishingly daftly named, I'm not even going to be able to say this because it's in and then the and symbol box. If you try to make a word out of that, you can certainly write it, but you can't say it. So I'll just call it inbox, the inbox control unit included with the garment. The trouble is, if you want that airbag to do anything useful, you need a subscription, and that'll set you back a further £120 a year. Or if you want to buy it outright with no subscription, then the bill will be another £400. So basically, you are paying nearly £800 for this functioning airbag vest with a working airbag that'll work for as long as you keep it. The good news is that you can replace the cartridges when the airbag goes off, if you should happen to be so unlucky as to need it on impact, but there is apparently a limit to the number of times it will reinflate before the whole thing switches off. That's not listed, not described in the garment product description. Okay, so anything else I wanted to say? I was just going to put a banner up. Don't forget that was the one. Yes, I knew I wanted to do something. If you do enjoy the show, set yourself a reminder. Elevenses goes out Wednesdays and Sundays at 11 AM. It's nearly always live. Occasionally it's recorded. Very, very rarely I miss a show because I'm doing something else. The easiest way to follow these shows is actually to subscribe and catch up on my YouTube channel. But you can also follow it on Facebook, of course. But if you do go to YouTube, like the video, and then watch my other content over there, you can catch up with the channel on www.youtube.com/survival skills. So that's where you'll find the Elevenses. Right, okay, on to motorcycles. Now, one of the delights of riding a motorcycle is that it's relatively uncomplicated if you want it to go around corners. The theory is sometimes a mystery to riders, but the practical aspects are fairly straightforward. You input a torque, a turning force through the handlebars. Because the front wheel is attached to the handlebars through the steering assembly, the front wheel turns too. That generates a roll movement, and the roll movement in turn causes the bike to lean, and then a leaning motorcycle rolls around in a circle if nothing else is changing. And the interesting thing, of course, is that the steering geometry that is built into most motorcycles designed to ensure that the bike self-rights, so that it stands itself upright again as soon as the rider stops pressing the bars. But of course, manufacturers can't resist the temptation to go one better, and in this case it's Honda attempting to have the bike itself take the strain. So here's what they've developed. I'll give you a zoom in look on this. What they have is a system which mounts two motors either side of the rear wheel. So if I just zoom in, there you can see the picture there with the thing upright, and you can see there are two motors and they're rotating in opposite directions. So effectively what they do is they cancel each other out. So what happens if the bike you want to lean over? Well, now the motors can be used to create a torque through their spinning, which encourages the bike to change lean angle. So what Honda actually say here is that if they're rotating opposite of each other, they provide stability. If the left-hand motor is rotating clockwise and the other counterclockwise, then it helps the bike lean into left-hand corners, and that's what you see here. And then if the motor then changes direction, and if the right side motor rotates counterclockwise and the other clockwise, then it helps to stand the bike up coming out of corners. Well, frankly, I have never had any trouble getting a bike to steer around corners, not after I learned about counter steering a couple of years into my riding career anyway. And I've never had trouble tipping into bends to get around them, or the bike steering upright again. So personally on this occasion I will take Colin Chapman's advice, and I will go for simplify and add lightness. It's rarely wrong as a technique. Right, okay, so only got one short story about bikes today, but if you want a customer for life, the best way is usually to start them young. I got onto a Honda 125 when I was 19, and I've ridden more Hondas than I've ridden anything else. Um, and that might be what this electric race bike is about. Let's have a quick look at it. I'll just again zoom in so you can see a little bit more clearly. Here we go. Now, what is this for? Well, it's a mini bike. It's a concept at the moment, but it's appearing apparently at the upcoming Tokyo-based Japan Mobility Show, which is scheduled for the end of this month, so any day now really. It's called the EFV. It looks pretty much like a race bike. It's fitted with slick tyres. It gets those clip-on handlebars, and they complement the race seat and fairing. And the machine gets the same power unit as an electric trials bike, which competed in the All Japan Trial Championship last year, but it doesn't get a gearbox, unlike that bike. Now, less obvious is that the bike also incorporates speakers, so it can emit brum brum noises. Now, it's said to be an easy to ride machine for aspiring young racers to train on, and it's reported that the machine is actually being developed as a side project by a volunteer team of young engineers. Now, it's also rumoured that Japan will see a one-make racing championships for this machine, and because Yamaha are going to apparently roll out the bike as a limited production model, and it'll be suitable. It will be basically, that will be what will be used for that race series. Right, now, before I conclude with today's in-depth piece, which is on heated clothing, I just want to remind you of where you can go to get some sound advice about riding. You can pop over to my publisher at lulu.com and you can find my inexpensive, well, my paperbacks are not too expensive. If you want some really inexpensive downloads, though, some ebooks, then visit my coffee shop. Those are the places to go. So have a look at those. Why has that gone as two posts? Very weird. All right, anyway, over to the last item for the day then. I did promise group riding, but I pushed that back a couple of weeks because it suddenly chilled down, and of course all the articles on staying warm on the bike have suddenly popped out. So let's have a look at what we can do for ourselves. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that we're increasingly happy to take scientific advice on how to dress for the slide. We're learning all about abrasion, we're learning about the strengths and weaknesses of knitted and woven fabrics. We're listening to people like Associate Professor Chris Hurren and the Moto Cap scheme that he's been working on. We're looking at the results of the Sharp helmet testing regime and comparing that with manufacturer claims. But what about dressing for the time of year? Well, as I say, right now the temperatures plummeted suddenly, dropped about 10 degrees last week in one day, virtually one day, and the blog articles are starting to appear. Yet, what always astonishes me when we talk about keeping warm is that we often don't appear to pay very much attention to the science behind it. So let's try to introduce you to some of the problems of trying to stay warm on a motorcycle. Right, so first of all, why does getting cold matter? Well, it's simple enough. Once we chill down, the first things that suffer are the brain's functions and muscle control. And there goes our ability to make sound decisions and control the bike. Now, I still remember my very first experience of really cold weather. I've been up to the university playing fields for a game of football, and it actually took place in glorious sun, what felt like quite mild conditions, but of course we were running around, so probably wasn't as warm as all that, because even before I'd got back on the bike, as soon as the sun had set, the frost had set in. So just after 4 o'clock really, I commenced a 2-hour ride back to where my parents lived, which was down in Kent. So I had to cross South London, then ride out into the country, and the temperature plummeted out on that ride. Now, by the time I got to Maidstone, which was about 5 miles from where I actually lived, I couldn't actually stop shaking with the cold. I was well beyond the shivering stage. The whole body was physically shaking. And I do recall that as I got to the edge of town, I shifted down to third gear to go around the roundabout, and then I simply couldn't pull the clutch lever in again to change back up. So I rode the rest of the way home, all the way home in third gear. And a mile or so after that, I couldn't stop either because my brake fingers had seized up, and I ended up running straight through a red traffic light. Fortunately, there was nothing coming. The only way I stopped the bike on the drive was actually drove up to the garage door and stalled it. Now I realised later, of course, that what I was actually suffering from, whoops, that's not the right picture, was the first stages of hypothermia. The problems with hypothermia is that you often don't realise that you are in the early stages, because they kind of creep up on you subtly, but by the time you get to the point where muscles don't work and you can't think straight, you genuinely are hypothermic. But the borderline between just being cold and being hypothermic is very easy to cross on a motorcycle. A lot of people really don't understand just how easy it is. We don't notice that our brain function, for example, is impaired. We do notice when muscles start to go and when we start to shiver uncontrollably. But I was certainly unfit to be riding the bike at that point, and I was probably quite likely to actually needed to test out the abrasion resistance of my riding kit at that point. So this is why staying warm matters. So most of us will probably have experienced days when we got really, really cold on a motorcycle. Now, so what do we do to stay warm? Well, a couple of the blogs were telling readers that the key to staying warm is to wear layers. A couple of the others were about heated grips or heated gloves. Now, of course, most of the articles actually link to a specific product, which is, of course, always better than anything else that the competition put out. But whenever I read things like this, I find it really difficult not to go back to my science roots, because whilst technically nothing in the articles was actually untrue, they completely failed to understand the issues of staying warm. They certainly didn't explain anything, and they made extravagant claims about the effectiveness of their chosen garments. So, back to the science. Now, if we have two objects in contact and they are at different temperatures, we create a temperature gradient. One object is higher in temperature than the other. There is a gradient of temperature between the two, and heat flows down a temperature gradient from hot to cold. This is why a pan of water warms up when you turn the gas on underneath it, but cools down again as soon as you turn the gas off. The gas is hot, hotter than the water heats up. Once the gas is off, the water is cooler than the air, the water cools down again. Now, the naked human body is a little bit more complex, but the essentials remain the same. It's assumed that we aren't wearing any clothes, and we'll also assume that we're not sitting in the sun, so we're in the shade, so we're not being heated directly by the sun either. Our skin is in contact with the air. If the air is extremely hot and exceeds our body temperature, which as I'm sure you know is around about 37 Celsius, 98 Fahrenheit, then the issue is staying cool, because the temperature gradient means heat flows from the hotter air to our cooler skin. But more usually, the air is colder than our skin. So then the temperature gradient flows from hot to cold, and it means heat flows from our skin to the outside world. And as the skin cools, we warm the world around us just a teeny weeny bit. Now, if we were dead, of course, then our body would continue to cool until it was the same temperature as the air, and that's what TV pathologists do when you see them measuring temperature and estimating the time of death from the body temperature. Now, what if we're not dead? Well, very, very approximately, if we're naked and we're not exercising to create more body heat, then the lowest temperature we can tolerate without chilling is around 25 degrees Celsius, 77 Fahrenheit. We're still losing heat because the skin temperature is warmer than the air temperature, but the losses are compensated for down to about 25 degrees because the body produces heat of its own. Now, once the body temperature drops below 25 degrees, once the air temperature drops below 25 degrees, then the body can no longer produce enough heat to maintain body temperature. And since there is a lot more outside world than there is our body, we continue to lose heat. And the colder our environment, the steeper the temperature gradient, and the more rapidly we lose that heat. So we feel ourselves getting cold quickly. So this is why we wear clothes. We try to control the rate of heat loss down that temperature gradient from body to outside world. And this leads me directly to the next important piece of science. We need to understand how materials impede the flow of heat from the warm side to the cold side. Now this is known as thermal resistance, and we can measure it. I won't bore you with actual measurements, but this R value is useful. It's used in usually for commercial insulating. You may well find it if you need insulation in your wall or in your roof, for example. So the R value gives you a measure of the material's ability to resist heat flow through a given thickness of that material. And in essence, the higher the R value, the greater the degree of thermal insulation. Now, hopefully, you'll see that there are two ways to slow down the loss of heat using thermal insulation. First of all, you could use more of one type of thermally resistant material. Essentially, you could put two shirts on. Doubling the thickness of the shirts will double the R value of the shirts as an insulator. Or you could switch to using a different material which has a higher thermal resistance. For example, you could switch out your cotton shirt for a down jacket instead. The down jacket has a much higher R value, so you'll stay a lot warmer with your thermal down vest or jacket than you would with your cotton jacket. Now in either case, it takes more time for the same amount of heat to flow across the material. That's why we stay warmer for longer. But there is no 100% effective insulation. All materials allow some thermal conductivity, so there is an R value for everything, and everything allows some heat to transfer out. So hopefully now you should see that there are three important factors. The first one is the rate at which our body can produce heat. The second one is the rate at which our body heat flows across a garment. And thirdly, the temperature gradient is important, i.e. how cold it is outside our clothing. So let's try and put that into a context again. If it's not too cold and we're wearing clothing which insulates us by just the right amount, then the body heat loss to the outside world is balanced by the heat we generate internally. We stay at just the right temperature and we feel nice and comfortable. Now, effective insulation will slow that down, but it can't insulate it completely. So once the temperature falls sufficiently and starts to create a steeper temperature gradient, then what happens is even the insulation that we're wearing cannot prevent heat loss to the environment. So we start to lose heat. We get cold effectively. Now this rate of chilling is what matters, because if we have effectively insulating clothing, we won't get too cold on a short ride, because basically the time we're exposed to the colder air won't be long enough for a large amount of heat to be lost through the insulating material, and then we'll be back in the warmth and we'll warm up again. And that's why I'd always been sort of reasonably warm on my short ride back and forth to college in just that leather jacket and a pair of jeans. But as soon as we start doing longer rides, like that night when I was out in the icy weather, we are exposed to the chilling air for a lot longer. And the kit that kept us warm on that short winter commute suddenly doesn't cut the mustard. Now, that I think is enough for this week. I'll come back to it next week, and I'll be looking at some of the solutions, including so-called thermal clothing, the effect of layering up, how some materials are more resistant to heat loss than others, and we'll look at the relative benefits of heated gloves and grips and what they actually achieve. And then finally, I'll explain why if you really want to stay warm on a motorcycle, then the heated vest is the way to go, because it feeds extra heat into the body core. We'll talk all about that next week. All right, thank you very much indeed for joining the show. Don't forget, if you are able to, subscribe and like. That's always very nice. It helps other people find these shows and find my channel and generally look at what I do. If you like the show, of course, don't forget you can always give me a coffee over on my coffee page. That's always greatly appreciated, very much indeed. While you're over on my YouTube channel, if you are first-time visitors here and you're normally watching on Facebook, do check out my 60-second safeties and 60-second science series. They all try to offer you some very useful information, but in a very quick to watch, easy to digest format. Okay, that is it for today. If you are out there on the bikes, do remember to keep an eye on the weather. As I said, there is a weather warning out for parts of the UK, and it does look wet for a lot of the rest of the week, so bear that in mind. Check the weather, and if you are out there on the bike, do stay shiny side up. Thanks for looking in, and hopefully see you for the next show on Sunday.